The Wendigo Doll, a short horror story, written by Stories from the Attic, narrated by McConnell. In my family home, where I now live with my wife, our 2 children, and my grandmother, we have an open wood fire. Sitting on the mantelpiece above that fire is a strange little doll that has been in my family for the better part of 3 centuries. In structure, I was told by my grandmother, it is similar to a Russian matryoshka doll, in that the figurine as we see it is hollow. It has an ornate and intricately detailed outer layer that you see most often, but if you open it up, inside you will find a series of smaller and smaller dolls, equally as detailed and each hollowed out to contain a smaller version. If you were so inclined, you could take the many versions out and stand them side by side, just like a Russian doll, and view each member of this strange family reducing in height and size. Or so I was told. If this is indeed true, then the doll technically predates the Russian-style nesting dolls, which, though they seem to show a quaint and archaic vision of a peasant life, are actually not that old as objects. I am sure that there would be art historians, antique dealers, and students of comparative anthropology who would have a field day comparing my grandmother's doll to those found in Russia, and tracing them back to common origins. Unfortunately, they will never get the chance. For whilst in structure the doll does mirror the construction of the Russian dolls, it is here that the similarity ends. The figurine on my mantel isn't a matryoshka doll. It's a Wendigo. I say, or so I was told, because as a child I was forbidden to touch the doll. I am still wary about it even now. For all I know, there are no dolls inside. My grandmother forbade us ever to open it and to take out the smaller dolls that she said were inside, and terrified by her reasons, we never did. "Once the Wendigo has fed," she would say, "there is no taking back. What's inside stays inside forever." The doll itself was carved by my great-great-grandfather back when my people didn't live in houses that had mantelpieces or fires contained within a hearth. If they wanted warmth, they didn't sit before the fire, but around it. They would collect the wood to fuel it from the forest with their bare hands and ignite the kindling with sparks from flint. That same fire would cook the meat that would feed their family and would cast enough light to keep the predators, with whom they shared the night, at bay. They knew how to use the land, how to use the forest. They knew to respect it, and also when to hide from the things that lived within it. My great-great-grandfather carved the Wendigo cross-legged before such a fire, not as a toy, but as a warning and a reminder. He, so the story went, had seen one. He wanted others to share the knowledge, to understand the nature of the thing. The reason, my grandmother once told me, that there are smaller dolls inside was to show how the creature eats. With every living thing it consumes, it grows around it, becomes large enough to absorb the physical creature and the life force it has within it. The larger its prey, the larger the Wendigo becomes, meaning that though it can swallow a bear or chew through a moose or even a village full of people, it is never, ever full. Instead, it is emaciated, deathly thin, wasting away with a hunger that drives it forever onwards, in a craze of starvation, on a never-ending hunt. As a child, I was terrified of that doll. It was only when I was 26 years old that I found out just how accurate a depiction it was. Nowadays, when most people are introduced to the Wendigo as a myth or a concept, it is through popular culture, mostly TV. The descriptions come in 2 flavors. Sometimes the creature is seen as a nebulous, amorphous thing, referred to in passing as a folk tradition or spook story told by the indigenous peoples of North America. In fact, it was in this way that my wife first became familiar with the word, through some offhand and deliberately vague reference in the Stephen King novel. The alternative is the exact opposite, whereby people encounter the Wendigo in a form so cartoonish and caricatured that it becomes a video game baddie, a highly detailed Monster of the Week creature feature that bears little or no resemblance to what the folklore around the thing actually states. These are the usual introductions. For me, it was neither, because somehow, in our family, the Wendigo had always been there. Whenever I write the word Wendigo, I find myself capitalizing the first letter of its name. Maybe because whenever it was mentioned to me, it was always just Wendigo rather than the Wendigo, as if it were a proper noun, and the thing's name rather than a collective term for a species. Or perhaps because the only times I saw the word written was in my grandmother's hand, and she was never too particular about mixing capitals and lowercase in her writing. Either way, the Wendigo in our family in some ways served the function that the bogeyman or El Cuco might in other families. It was a spectre or monster used by parents to chastise and keep us in line. Yet in other ways, it was vastly different. Firstly, unlike most bogeymen that live in a specific place, the space under the stairs, the woodshed at the bottom of the garden, or the closet or attic, the Wendigo was, instead, a creature not bound by location. Whilst it was most often depicted in the forest that was undoubtedly its natural habitat, moving through and amongst the trees somewhere in the wilds, there was also another, less well-defined sense in which the creature, perhaps in a more spiritual form, was able to get you, even at home. As if somehow that spirit that lived in the wilderness could slink into the concrete fortresses we built for ourselves, unfazed by noise and electric streetlights, and grasp us in our beds, dragging us back to the forests and plains we had left behind, to become part of them once again, by allowing it to consume us. The other difference was that whereas the bogeyman mythology, with its distinct family idiosyncrasies, tended to die off as the children grew older, becoming less potent and eventually shrinking from mention altogether as confidence, maturity, and particularly incredulity grew with age, the same was not true of the Wendigo. This creature's clutches were tighter because they still held the adults in their grip. Somehow this creature, this folklore, was woven into the fabric of what it was to be part of this culture, and whilst most, sitting in a coffee shop or at their work desk, would casually laugh off the idea of still fearing such things, in private, in the cloistered familiarity of the family home, the Wendigo's shadow still loomed largely. It certainly did in my home. Worse still was the forest. During the day, the forest was a bounty for me, a cool, sun-dappled place of tranquility and escape, but also a place for imagination, adventure, and history. When I was a kid, we would drive from town into the forest perhaps once a week, often visiting entirely separate sections of forest, miles apart, but all of which had some importance to either my grandfather or grandmother. As we walked, they would reminisce, tell me stories of their pasts, the past of their people, and the exploits of their families and friends. I loved those days, and especially the times we would camp over, though of course that meant dealing with the dark. When the sun first went down, things would be fine. We would be sitting together around the fire and feeling oddly protected by its warm orange glow. Plus, I was with the adults. As a child, whilst our belief in the dark things may not diminish in the presence of the adults, there is something in their confidence about the fact that you know they would protect you and that they do not seem worried by the threat that allows you to also feel safe. As long as they were awake, cooking over the fire, swapping jokes or telling stories, everything was fine. Eventually, though, it would be time for bed. I would crawl into the tent, feeling the night's chill against my skin and the cool, almost damp of the sleeping bag as I crawled inside. For a moment, my grandfather would be there, squatting at the entrance, wishing me good night, but then, with a single decisive shriek of the zipper, I would be inside alone. I knew that my grandparents would be able to see through the thin vinyl if I left the torch on, so, reluctantly, I pushed the button and invited the darkness to slip into bed beside me. As soon as the tent plunged into black, it was as if someone had turned the volume up on the forest. Suddenly my ears were hypersensitive, picking out every snap of a twig and rustle of leaves. Suddenly the safety I had felt around the fire disappeared. Now, huddled inside the tent, unsure at some points if my eyes were open or closed, so all-encompassing was the dark, I lay silent, listening and imagining. In my childhood fancies, the Wendigo was never quite fully formed. Its image, based upon that strange figurine from the mantelpiece, had a number of striking and notable features. The animal skull face, the twisted knot of antlers and horns that protruded upwards as if erupting from the ridges over the eyes, the thin, almost skeletal body, strewn over with hair that hung in thick, matted sheets, and yet, despite these details, it remained amorphous, undefined, an image never entirely complete. I often thought in later years that this may have been where the thing's true power lay. The fact that it was never clear, never fully delineated, meant that it could be anything, could somehow retain those key features and yet also morph and change, swirling and shifting into ever more terrifying forms. The same is true for normal predators. Seeing the whole animal in a zoo will never be as terrifying as catching a glimpse of its eyes in the darkness, a flicker of a tooth, or the gleam from a claw. Sometimes the suggestion of an image, the incomplete picture, is far more terrifying. On those nights, lying in my sleeping bag and running over and over in my head the snippets or stories my grandparents had shared, that sketchy image pinned me in place. I dared not move, hardly even breathe, for fear that something might hear. Something that could, I knew, with cold yellow eyes, have been watching us from the forest, always there, always hungry. For in those moments I remembered the times when the adults' bravery had cracked, the times when they had winced at the thought. It happened often, because to them it was more than a story. There was something in the way my grandmother would shrink at the mention of the word, how she would shush us or swat us with a dish rag, chastising us not to joke about such things. I remember that when my wife first asked about the strange figurine on the mantel, back when we were first dating, my grandmother had placed her index finger on her lips, hushed her, and then carefully, with almost ceremonial reverence, lifted the tiny sculpture and carried it outside of the house. Only then would she explain its origins and history. Once Donna, my now wife, had left, I asked my grandmother why she had made such a fuss. Donna was already getting used to some aspects of my cultural heritage, but this kind of spooky nonsense didn't exactly make her feel comfortable. My grandmother apologized and explained that it was tradition. Ideally, you would not say the word Wendigo within the homestead, the camp, or the marked-out area. It was particularly important not to say it aloud in front of outsiders. I balked at this idea, not a little offended. She's not an outsider, she was my guest. I'm hoping long-term she might become part of the family, but that's not going to work if you keep referring to her as an outsider or thinking of her in that way. I was genuinely upset. I also made a point of reminding her that I had definitely heard her use the word in the house before, and that this current hocus-pocus was some newly made-up tradition that had somehow, out of the blue, now become of the utmost importance. I couldn't help feeling, for Donna's benefit. My grandmother's head sank, and again she apologized, trying to explain that it was difficult sometimes to marry the older traditions with modern sensibilities. She went on to say that she had not meant to offend me, and that referring to Donna as an outsider was not meant to exclude her. "It is like," she said, "entering a house where the walls are still wet with paint. The people inside, wearing clothes that have been stained before, aren't worried if they get some on them. But you don't want the guests to get any stains, so you warn them and tell them to avoid touching things that will leave a mark and ruin things that they might want to take with them when they leave. It's okay for us to say it. It's too late for us to close the gate now. There are stains on all of us." This kind of oblique metaphorical explanation was typical of her. I didn't pretend to actually understand what she was talking about, but I did recognize genuine contrition. She really was sorry. and I couldn't stay mad at her. I gripped her around the shoulders and pulled her to my chest, kissed her on the head, and said it was okay. "Just, please, try not to scare her off. I really like her," I said, talking over the top of her head. She, in turn, looked up mischievously. "I could tell. She's genuinely nice." She then suggested that I invite Donna over for dinner later in the week. It would have been a nice moment, had it not been interrupted by the smell of smoke. I should explain at this point that I was raised by my grandparents. My father disappeared before I was born, and my mother passed away when I was 4. I still have some vague memories of her, but for all intents and purposes, my grandparents were my parents. They filled every role and duty that you would expect your immediate parents to take on, and though the generational gap did present problems now and again, especially as I got older and tried to balance my heritage with my modern life, they were basically mum and dad for me. An unfortunate consequence of this was that they were much older, which meant that, statistically speaking, I was likely to lose them much earlier than my friends with their parents. I had realized this incredibly early in my life, and it was a fact that hung like a weight of dread over me for much of my adolescence. I had never realized, however, never once anticipated, that I might lose them whilst they were still alive. Though we didn't know the exact cause, we did both know who was responsible for the burning smell. We both rushed to the kitchen just in time to see the cheese toast catching fire under the grill. I pulled out the tray and dropped it clanking loudly into the sink, running the tap with a loud hiss and conjuring up a billowing cloud of steam. Behind us, a voice from the doorway asked, "What the hell's going on? What's with all the racket? Why does it smell like a forest fire in here? Are you trying to burn down the damn house?" My grandmother and I turned to see my grandfather. White hair pulled back and plaited over his shoulder, watching us with a now familiar expression of confusion and frustration. The deterioration had started slowly, like a process of erosion. In fact, that was exactly how I thought of it. Whenever anyone mentioned dementia, I thought of my grandfather's self as a statue, once carved in bronze or marble, replaced by one made from compressed ash. In my mind's eye, I saw this statue, an exact replica of the man I saw standing before me, formed of soft material that, as the wind blew, loosened fragments would fly away from. Sometimes just a speck was carried off on the breeze. On other days, or when it rained, whole sections would be carried off, disappearing and changing from a solid, consequential piece into dust, powder, nothing. At that point, he was still him, but eventually the steady breeze of time and disease would take him. This was the 3rd time in just under a week that he had put something on to cook and entirely forgotten about it. The previous week he had finished making toast, thankfully unplugged the toaster and put it into the sink to soak. His grasp of pronouns and proper names seemed to have disappeared, sliding off the edge of his thoughts like a slippery piece of food off the end of a fork. He would be talking in full flow and come to mention some individual or the name of a place, and suddenly his mind would hit a gap, as if he were walking along a familiar road only to find that a chasm or sinkhole had opened up in the middle of the path. He would stutter and clutch at the name, his eyes becoming small and his forehead furrowing as he struggled to recall. Recently, whenever it happened, he would reach with his hand forwards, as if he were literally grasping at the memory, before it flew away, trying to pluck it out of thin air or capture it. He never quite succeeded. Over the next 2 years, the decline seemed to speed up. When people talk about going downhill, you still think of it as a steady progression. You forget that when things go downhill, a ball, a bike, or a car, the grasping tug of gravity pulls it ever more quickly, speeding it up as it descends, accelerating faster and faster towards the bottom. A year ago, I married Donna. I had, of course, been keen to marry her, but given the choice, I would perhaps have waited until I could have saved for a bigger and more expensive wedding. Seeing, however, my grandfather, who for so many years had been pin-neat in his habit and dress, descend the stairs in his Y-fronts and a T-shirt pulled on backwards, I realized that if he were to see me married and actually experience the day in any meaningful way, it had to be sooner rather than later. Donna, of course, completely understood, and, contrary to what I might have wanted to provide for her, was more than happy with a small-scale and unpretentious wedding, her mantra being that as long as the important people were there, we could have been married in the backyard for all she cared. As it turned out, Gramps was still enough of himself to offer to walk Donna down the aisle, she having lost her father a few years earlier. It was a magical day, and one that I always think of whenever I remember him. It's the memory that I prefer to conjure, though of course there are others, and one in particular that forces its way forwards and haunts my thoughts. It was around 2 months ago that we, as a family, had the conversation. Having noticed his mental deterioration and gotten a confirmatory diagnosis from the doctors, we had been forced to confront him with the reality of his situation. Of course, to him it seemed just as though he was becoming more forgetful, a natural consequence of getting older. He did not remember with any clarity how he had defecated in the shower rather than the toilet, or how he had gone out the back door leaving it wide open only to be found wandering confused around a quarter-mile from the house. At first, when we suggested to my grandfather that he take an available position in a local care home where his round-the-clock care and appropriate medication could be better managed, he was angry, clearly perceiving this suggestion as some kind of betrayal. Seeing his face when we told him this was difficult. It was a picture of pain and confusion. Once again, his hands raised, ready to grasp at the memories that would help him to argue his case, to make the point that this move was unnecessary. As he did, however, I derailed his opposition by asking him to tell me who I was. Confronting him with this question was painful for me, as it forced me to acknowledge the truth of how much had already been lost. For a moment he was incredulous, answering with vague dismissals of, "Well, obviously you're you, aren't you? You know who you are. What a stupid question. This is ridiculous, is what it is." He said these things, but he never said my name. Eventually, taking his grasping hand in both of mine and allowing it to melt down, I looked him in the eyes and reassured him. It was okay. It was just the name that was missing for now, but eventually it would get to the point where he could not recognize me at all. To keep that day as far away as possible, we needed to get him the best care. Falling silent, he stared, first at me and then at my grandmother. His hand came up once again, though this time it was not to grasp at anything, but to touch my grandmother's cheek. He remembered that he loved her, even if he couldn't remember her name. My grandfather agreed to take up the position at the home on one condition. He wanted him and me to take a final trip out to the forest, which he said he wanted to see one last time, before, as he saw it, he had his freedom taken from him. He stressed over and over that it was to just be us. My grandmother was not invited. It was, he joked, time for the boys, an idea that seemed to give him great joy, though he could not have named those boys if his life depended upon it. Despite my grandmother's concerns about his welfare and my ability to take care of him outside of the home, my grandfather's mind was made up, and whilst he couldn't remember whether he had brushed his teeth that morning or why he had put the kettle in the fridge, somehow this one idea managed to take root, and there would be no talking him out of it. This he remembered. We had set up camp at a place that we had often stayed when it was the three of us. One strange symptom of this kind of mental deterioration is that it often damages the short-term memory, whilst leaving the long-term memory intact. My grandfather could remember the first hamburger he ever tasted when he was 11, but couldn't remember my name. On this trip, however, his last to the forest he loved, it was old memories that were needed and poignantly relevant. We stayed up most of the night talking and, with my nudging reminders, reminiscing. He talked to me about his own father and the time that he had come to this very spot with him. He told me about my mother and how a few times he had managed to wrestle her from my grandmother's grasp and bring her out to this spot. "It wasn't boys' time, but it sure was wonderful.
Just me and her and the forest."
That night, I spent more time just listening to my grandfather speak than I had in years. Another quirk of that night was that the old memories seemed to allow him pathways to newer ones. Thinking of my mother allowed him, for the first time in months, to fully recognize me. Being in this environment and at this spot that he associated with certain people seemed to clear the obstructive bracken from his path and allow him to wander freely once again, if only for a night, around the tracks of his mind. Before we turned in for the night, he turned to me and said he had something especially important to say. He told me that in the olden days, in some communities, it was considered a blessing to have a son rather than a daughter. He said, had been blessed with both. More so than that, he had been blessed with a particular order.
"Your mother was my only child, a female. We have never spoken of this, but there was great joy when she was born because, as a girl child, she would break the line. For 3 generations before me there had only ever been boys born in this family."
I smiled, thinking of the stories I had heard of my 4 great-uncles, though the smile disappeared as I realized that I knew nothing of their ends, or whether they too had succumbed to this disease. Had the smile remained, my grandfather would soon have removed it.
"They were all boys,"
he muttered quietly,
"and they all belonged to him."
I stared and said nothing, wondering if this was just another example of the gibberish that had begun to creep into his speech. It wasn't.
"This thing that came for me, it comes for all the men of this family eventually. It always has. I'm not even sure why."
Then he turned and gripped my shoulders.
"But you were born of a woman of our household, not from the male line. You're a new branch. You should break the chain."
With that, he rose and trudged slowly towards his tent. I began making my own preparations for bed, and heard him call from inside the tent.
"Good night, Adahi."
It was the first time he had said my name for months. It would also be the last. Around 3 a.m., I was woken by the sound of my grandfather's screaming. I came out of my tent to find him standing naked, staring at the tree line, and shouting at the top of his lungs in a language I did not understand. The only word I recognized, one that he said over and over, was Wendigo. In his hand, he held a huge branch taken from the fire that was aflame at one end. I cautiously took a few steps towards him, not wanting to startle him in case he burnt himself, or me, but I was stopped in my tracks when I saw to whom, or rather to what, he was speaking. Though it sounds ridiculous for a thing of such size, at first I didn't notice it, in the dark, against the tree line. In some ways, it was as if the Wendigo was part of the tree line, part of the darkness, and only as my grandfather screamed at it did it tear itself from the background, as if melting out and emerging from it. It peered down at us with a desperate, savage hunger that seemed to stretch back eons. Its face was like the bare skull of a moose, with only the thinnest veil of flesh painted onto the bones. Horns and antlers, twisted together like a plate of stabbing force, rose out from the sides of the head. The eyes, yellow at the center and a muddy, rotten grey around the edges, stared down at us in a way that showed in their depth that never-ending hunger of which my grandmother had spoken. From its mouth, a tongue, swollen and half-rotted, lolled and swung pendulously, flicking upwards as it lunged and careened at us. Its spindly limbs seemed to rot and putrefy even as it moved, flesh hanging in dried, leathery tatters from the bones. I watched as it paced towards my grandfather. As it did, however, my grandfather did not retreat. Instead, he seemed somehow jubilant and ran forwards, towards this thing as big as a house and as terrible as a god. He ran, screaming and flailing the branch, its yellow-orange flames streaking across the blackness like paint, and I could not help noticing that he was smiling as he did so. As he ran, in jerky, haphazard staggers, he cried out in English,
I knew you'd come. I knew it. I'm ready. You hear me? I'm ready, but I will be the last. The last. There are 6 inside. I am the last. The price is paid."
With that, he ran headlong into the darkness and disappeared. For one awful second, I was alone with that thing, just me, it, and the forest. Then, however, it turned, and in a single twisting motion bowed its head, following my grandfather into the forest. I never saw my grandfather again. Nobody did. I ran into the dark after him, chasing him and whatever the thing was that I had seen, but saw nothing but darkness and wood. In some way, I think I knew that he was gone, and that no matter how long I searched, I would never find him. This idea was confirmed for me when I arrived home that evening to find my grandmother waiting. She said nothing, but she was not at all surprised that I had returned alone. That night, and the thought of what might have become of my grandfather, haunts me. Of course, I have no idea of the specifics, but I have a feeling that that night, though it remained forever hungry, the Wendigo grew a little bigger. Now I understand why my grandmother forbade me ever to open the doll. She was scared of what, or indeed who, we might find inside. I have never opened it, but I hope beyond hope that my grandfather was right, that he was the last. The price has been paid, and there will only ever be 6 inside. This has been The Wendigo Doll, a short horror story, written by Stories from the Attic, narrated by Robin McConnell. Copyright 2021 by Michael Vandervoort. Production copyright by Michael Vandervoort.